Here we are again, and this time we're talking about Silverpoint. Once again, we're doing the second class on Silverpoint. I've promised you far more drawing this time, and we're certainly going to do that. We'll have a warm-up exercise and then a very long drawing session. And I'm just going to warn you, this is going to be the last class that we really deal with the figure and with drawing the figure, and that's what our long drawing is going to be about, not the warm-up, but the longer piece. Because from now, we're going to move into drawing with all media, abstract concepts, how to deal with those. We do have colored pencil. I had forgotten about that last week, so we got colored pencil. Then we're going to go into folds, animals, drawing from the imagination and memory, all sorts of things. But all drawing media can really apply to all of this. And I just want to say in advance, before some of you go, abstraction, I'm not sure if I'm interested in that. Maybe I'll skip a couple of weeks. No. Because this isn't abstraction like throwing paint at the wall and calling it art. What I want to talk about is when we look at realistic things and we're trying to break down how we're going to approach them. There are ways to sort of pull out the concepts behind what you're seeing, the things that are interesting, and abstract them, sort of the same path, for example, that some of the Cubists or other abstract artists took to get to where they did, or even the Impressionists who weren't putting every last little detail in there. So abstraction doesn't necessarily mean the same as abstract art. So I hope you will stick around for those two classes as well. So in the meantime, I wanted to let you know that on my own time last week, I did some artwork on some of those pieces of Silverpoint prepared ground that I showed you. And I just wanted to quickly show you a couple of them right here in the screen. I started off with my sketchbook, doing some really quick sketches. Are a little difficult to see because of the glare, from those plaster casts. And then I decided on the illustration board, I would go ahead and, do something a little bit more careful, where I tried to look at the proportions a bit more. And, the general overall effect is very much like a pencil drawing. But I liked the weight of the stylus that I got that had two ends in it. It's a little harder to control than the black one that only has the one piece of silver in. But after I started getting into it, I liked the difference between the thicker and the thinner wire. And it's really just a matter of, perhaps speeding up some of the process so you're not putting so many lines down by using a slightly thicker end. What I did find was that I liked two coats of the Golden's ground. When I went to the third coat and did a third coat, I wasn't so keen on that. It was a little bit more slick. Now, everybody is going to like a different type of surface. And so it's worth, preparing like I did on a couple of different types of paper. Put some ground down, one layer, then two, then three. See what you like the best and what gives you sort of the best effect. One thing I did really like was I added, one of my experiments was to add a little bit of gouache just for color into the ground as I painted it on. I actually, you probably could do it in a little dish to the side, but I was speeding up the process and went ahead and did it right there on the paper. So what that did was it gave me an effect very much like the toned paper that I love so much. And I was able to do the drawing in Silverpoint and then go back in charcoal and do do the regular sort of highlighting that I like to do anyway. So I just wanted to mention that there are all sorts of possibilities. Another thing that I did, and I'm going to show you in just a minute how to use the traditional ground that I got from Rublev, the little bag that I showed you last week. I'm going to show you how that works. When I was experimenting, I took one of my drawings I didn't like so much, and I said to myself, well, what happens if I try to cover it up? Well, two coats doesn't completely cover the Silverpoint you had underneath, but it's interesting because it does mean that you could, even just with Silverpoint, do a basic drawing, cover it with another layer or two of ground, and then use that as sort of the guidelines for doing your more complete drawing. So there are a lot of options there that we don't necessarily have just with pencil and paper, and it's something for you to try out. So let's get started. I'm going to go ahead and share the screen. Okay, so welcome back to Summer of Drawing, class number 12. Can you believe it? We have covered so much. It's really quite incredible. And just a quick recap for anyone who wasn't at the class last week. Silverpoint is a drawing that's made by dragging a silver rod or wire across a surface that's prepared with gesso or primer. And you need that because you need something that is rough enough to pull the flakes of silver or copper or whatever you're using off the wire and onto the paper, because it won't happen if you just use regular paper or wood or whatever. And other types of metal point can be used as well: copper, nickel, bronze, gold, etc., for different effects. Some metals tarnish faster than others. Some don't tarnish at all, and some styli will dull, faster than other ones. So a few things I wanted to talk about today is that we're going to sort of take this trip to Florence and back in the 1500s and look at how metal point was used and silver point was used, and try some of the same sort of artwork. I did want to point out, though, it's not as if silver point was the only thing that people had. People have had chalk and various different marking, powder, pieces of lead, all sorts of things, drawing on wood, in wax, on various different types of rudimentary paper, then paper when it started to be made more often, on vellum, all sorts of things. So it's not as if, okay, you had chalk, then you had silver point, then you had graphite. Everything didn't happen just one at a time. And artists, since the dawn of time, have been mixing their media up. So grounds, we talked last week about the Golden's ground that was just a prepared silver point ground. And this week, I just want to show you what a more traditional ground is like. So this is a powder that comes from Rublev. I don't know exactly what is in it, but I imagine it's things like rabbit skin glue, the chalk. I don't know what else they might have put in there, but it is a traditional mixture of some sort. So how to make it, the instructions are right there on the bag, which is helpful. But what you do is you actually just take equal parts of water with the powder. So I just took 7 tablespoons of water and put them in this little jar. And then I added to that 7 tablespoons of the powder and mixed it up and let it stand for a while. So what that looks like after you've mixed it up is sort of like this. And then after it stands for a while, you can see on the left there, it's sort of like a very thick tapioca. It has that sort of feel to it. It had a lot of bubbles in it. Now, in order to then get it to liquefy, I imagine you can put this away and store it for a while. I'm not quite sure for how long, but we're going to find out because I have some still left in the jar. Then you can put it in a bowl of warm water to re-liquefy it, to then brush it onto your page. So I ran into everything was going well until then. I kept doing all those steps around the other artwork I was working on, so it didn't take a lot of extra time. But I ran into a problem when I was brushing this traditional ground on, because for whatever reason, I had little teeny lumps. There are probably ways to not do that, but I was just approaching it with the same sort of degree of approach that I did with the Goldens, very straightforward. Okay, this is what the directions say, this is what I'm going to do. I mixed it, and this is what I got. Now I was able to brush those little bits off and get rid of them. And some of them just sort of dissolved down into what I was brushing. So it's not as if you're stuck with them. But I just wanted to point that out because that was something that happened to me with this product that didn't happen with the pre-mixed stuff. And I'm imagining that's why you have to shake the bottle so well with the Golden's ground, is to avoid this sort of thing. And those of you who are better cooks than I probably know ways to introduce water and a powder together like that in a way that would not cause this kind of thing to happen. So that's just something to note. So from here, I went on and did some drawings, and I'm not necessarily going to show them to you because they're not that different from the other ones I just showed here. There's a little bit of a difference to the texture. There's a slightly creamier, beigeier finish. You can kind of see it here on the right. Slightly more beige finish to the actual ground itself, as opposed to what you can see over on the left, which was the original Golden's ground I used. And likewise, when the silver point is applied, it's a little bit, it's a little more antique looking. So if it definitely has a little bit more of that of that brown to it. But I found I had a hard time getting I liked the look that I got last week with the two layers of Golden's ground and then the Silverpoint. So I'm going to have to draw with this maybe for this next week and sort of see what this does that's different. Obviously, there are two slightly different looks. I'm curious to know whether these different bits of illustration board and paper over time will look different as well. They're not going to turn into Leonardo da Vinci drawings, but that's just something for you to know about. So that's as far as I got with my own experiments. So let's get on with some drawing. All right. As I mentioned, we're going to take a little bit of a trip in our imaginations to the 1500s in Florence. And so this is what Italy looked like at that time period. As you can see, it wasn't the Italy that we think of now. I mean, the towns and such and the cities some of those are the same, but it was divided up into all these separate states. And the separate states were often at war with each other, trying to take over one or the other. There was trade between them and a lot of travel between them, but there was also a lot of trouble between them. So Florence, right up there in the middle, where the fellow that we're going to sort of follow today, Benvenuto Cellini, where he would spend a lot of time was going back between Florence and Rome. He was back in that area quite a bit. And then he also went up to France. So he took sort of a hard left and went up to Paris for a while. And that was sort of the area he operated in. But many of these people traveled all around. You know, there were people traveling to Germany, to Austria, all over the place. So there was a lot of travel. Everyone didn't always just stay in their one area. But some people did. There were artists and goldsmiths and artisans of different types that never really traveled from their particular area. So Cellini lived from 1500 to sometime in the 1570s. Can't remember it off the top of my head. And during the course of his lifetime, he was in Florence during the siege of Florence. And so this is very much, you know, you see if you look over here, Florence, there's some of those buildings that you see there are buildings that if you go to Florence today that you see. But this whole idea of, you know, the warring camps, of having a wall around the city to defend yourself, of having this constant stress of conflict definitely affected his life and the lives of everybody who was alive during that particular time. So this is modern day Florence, and you can see, you know, to a great extent, the look of the buildings and some of the major buildings are still the same. So the reason why I am interested in talking to you about goldsmiths and why we're going this direction is because using Silverpoint and making drawings was a huge part of everything that was going on in the artisan world and the art world in Florence and in Italy and in Europe in general during the Renaissance. Because in order to create those beautiful paintings, those beautiful pieces of gold, the jewelry, the silver, all the rest of it, the carvings, some sort of preparation had to be made. Now you could do it in like I said, you know, all of those different materials. There was paper available, there was vellum, wood, you know, prepared surfaces, that sort of thing. But in particular, if you were someone like a goldsmith who was showing your client, this is what I plan to bake for you, you needed some way to do it. And Silverpoint, because silver was around, if you were a goldsmith or a silversmith, was an easy way to do that. One thing that's kind of interesting is a lot of drawings have not survived down through the years because occasionally, or perhaps even frequently, you would have the different shops or the different artisans would have somebody, an apprentice perhaps, prepare the ground on a piece of wood or paper. The drawing would be done, the piece would be finished, and then that would be either sanded off and you know, more gesso applied and another drawing would be done. In other words, people weren't thinking, hey, I need to have a drawer full of these drawings for people in you know, 500 years from now to have a look at. But this is the kind of scene that you might have seen. This actually was based on, you know, what a scene at a goldsmith in Florence would look like. Alessandro Fei actually didn't travel much from Florence for his entire life. So we can look at this and go, well, gosh, this is probably the kind of scene that we would see. And at the left in France and in the right in Germany, you know, a goldsmith shop was basically the same kind of thing. You got someone tending the fire, people doing the building and the casting, You've got, you know, a young apprentice up to something in the corner there. And then these are just some tools and things from the Museum of Art and Popular Customs in Seville, which I would love to visit sometime. But what is particularly interesting to me is over there on that drafting table, there are some drawings, and hanging up, you know, behind the drafting table are more drawings. So drawing was definitely a part of what was going on back in that, in those days. And here's just another painting. This is from Flanders, but a goldsmith in his shop with his clients and weighing out the gold. And, you know, you'd have these affluent people coming in and asking for certain things. Now, you might kind of wonder where the gold and the jewels come from. Often the clients themselves would supply someone, you know, so if I'm giving you the commission to make this beautiful vase, I am probably procuring the gold you need and giving it to you only what you need, and also just the gems that you need to put on this particular vase. So a lot of it was controlled by the patron in terms of giving supplies. And this actually went on in painting as well. If you wanted those really expensive pigments to make paint for a painting that you were commissioned to do, often it was the patron, the client, doling out those pigments. They would have procured them themselves. You wouldn't do what we do today, which is artists wouldn't necessarily have a huge storehouse of different pigments and drawing materials and stuff. You may have some, and you may have the less expensive. And as you became more famous and well off, you would have acquired your own. But it's sort of interesting to see how that worked. So goldsmithing, of course, had been around, you know, the gold, beautiful things, such as the Gates of Paradise. This is from the early 1400s. This is actually one piece of a very large set of gold doors. They were actually gilded bronze. But you can see how that entire tradition, it wasn't as if, you know, Cellini came along and produced a bunch of stuff out of nowhere. There was a large tradition. And this was all through Europe. You know, this is a Flemish pendant of Hercules. And you had this really decorative Mannerist style going on at this particular time when Cellini was around. These are different sorts of pendants for you know, for necklaces and such. The two on the left were created for the Medici family. I'm not quite sure by whom, but you know, this kind of level of ornamentation, a goldsmith who could pull this sort of thing off, you know, had work from very high level clients. So back to the Silverpoint part. I showed you this last week, this sketch designed for a statuette. As I said, somebody had to actually do the drawings and show what the statue or the vase or the you know, anything was going to look like. Here we have a clock salt that was designed by Hans Holbein's son, Hans Holbein the Younger. This was done in pen and black ink on paper with gray wash and red wash. So this is what I mean about, you know, they mixed in all sorts of media. It wasn't just, oh, you know, only one thing or only Silverpoint. A clock salt refers to dishes of salt that were put out on a fancy table were often very ornamented. And they started off by just being ornamented dishes. And then people got crazy, as you'll see later on. I have one of Cellini's to show you. But this was a particular one that included a clock and everything. And in there somewhere would have been a bowl that salt could have been put in. And Michelangelo himself, I put his whole name out there because we tend not to see it. We always call him by just the one name, like Prince. But he did a salt cellar design, and this is in black chalk. But what would happen is if you were a goldsmith and you weren't particularly great at drawing, but you were really good at being a goldsmith, you might ask your friend, an artist, or the patron himself might ask an artist, can you design this thing? And then give your design to so-and-so to make. So that was done commonly. Cellini was one of those who could do his own designs, but it wasn't always done. So in this particular case, you know, who knows who this was for. But what I want to show you, what we're sort of concentrating on today in class, is not just drawing sort of the compositions and things we've been talking about for the last few weeks, but really concentrating on proportion and relative shapes. In other words, it's all great to do the compositions and the landscapes and people and such that we've been talking about, but if we haven't got the measuring and the proportions under control, it becomes really difficult to make the whole effect of the charcoal or trois-couleurs or whatever it is look right. And so if you look at a drawing like this, you can see the marks that Michelangelo left so that he had, he had the basis to make the thing look right, to make it look even and well proportioned. So when you draw today, I want you to feel free to put any marks you need to on your page and draw in this particular manner, because we won't be looking at it so much from that whole no-tan and black and white and form aspect as we will from accuracy of the form. So here is just another couple of goldsmith designs done by Michelangelo. In this particular case, 2 ideas for a lamp. And a lamp would mean like an oil lamp, that sort of thing. So you can see that this was a part of what every artist thought, either of their own ideas or somebody asked them to do. You might be asked, hey, could you design so-and-so for so-and-so to make? So this is your first drawing assignment. Now, these things are fire tools from the 1500s, the same time period. These are obviously not made out of gold. They're wrought iron of some sort, and they have a little bit of ornamentation on. But what I would like you to do is for just a few minutes here, let's see, about 5-10 minutes, draw one or several or all of these fire tools with an idea of not worrying so much about, is this a beautiful drawing? You're drawing these individuals as if you were an apprentice in a shop, in this particular case, in maybe an ironmonger's shop, and you needed to draw out the plan for the blacksmith or whoever it was to actually create these objects. And so proportion has to be right. And when I mean proportion, I say, well, how big is that bottom piece? Like if I look at the fire tool that's on the far left, can I sort of like look at how big that is with my fingers and then go, okay, well, the next bit up is about the same size, and then maybe 2 more get me kind of close to the top of this tool. So this is just all about measuring and then trying to make one side look like the other side. Try to duplicate your curlicues and the forms and such. Don't worry if you can't see detail up close. This is not about looking at detail. This is about looking at the overall shape and just trying to get your proportions correct. And it's kind of nice that it's in black and white. So whether you're working in Silverpoint or whether you're working in pencil or whatever, it's pretty easy to see what's going on. Draw as many lines as you need to help you get things even. I'll give you a few minutes to do that. I'll just check the chat really quickly. Yeah, I think someone said they look like shop drawings. And I think that's an excellent way of describing them. Some of them have come down to us through history and they're works of art to us now. And especially if they were done by somebody, like Michelangelo, we really, we treasure them. But to a great extent, it was a means of communication and not something that was, particularly rarefied. And this is what I think is great about drawing in general. I mean, we draw for so many reasons. And when we think about, oh, I want to draw, what that conjures in our minds is usually kind of a mishmash. Do I want to sketch? Am I talking about a finished piece? Do I want it to look like a particular artist that I've seen? We're not really sure what it means, and therefore we're not really quite sure where to start. And so one of the things I've been trying to do is, as you've seen through this summer, is show not all, but a number of the ways that you can draw and some of the applications. And I just think it's very interesting to connect ourselves with previous artists and artisans and see how what we do is really not that different than what was done hundreds of years ago and even thousands of years ago. If you're talking about, the Egyptian drawings and such, somebody laid that stuff out. They didn't just go for it on the tomb. There was a plan there. Somebody had to make sure all of those hieroglyphics were going to fit in the given space. So however it was done, drawing of any sort had to be a part of it. And this is, I think, why I'm so interested in making sure that we are keeping the skill of drawing alive, because I myself have computer tools where I can draw on the screen and I can do things in Photoshop and other programs, and that's all great. But it is not like putting a pencil to paper. It is not the same thing. And the brain doesn't seem to react in the same way. We tend to become um, uh, sort of, our vision is narrowed by the tools we use on the computer, on what the engineer who designed the software thought we needed. Whereas when we are drawing on a sheet of paper, for some reason, we don't feel that same constraint. Our mind is open to any possibility, to things that we can imagine, to things that we can see, to how we can interpret. And without that sort of preset concept, we're free to just draw. But as I have also been pointing out, it's really good to have these basics of proportion and such under control. So even if you're drawing something simple like this, you want to do it carefully. You want to have some idea. Now you can then, go for it. And by the time you're doing the fourth one, you can be quite free about it and say, hey, I really don't care what this original looked like. My fire tool is going to be different. That's all well and good. But this is a good place to start. And I'd also like to sort of say that if you get the opportunity to go to a museum or some place where there are gold and silver objects or pottery from ancient days, those parts of the museums are usually not as well traveled. And if you want to stand there for a while and sketch, it's a great place to do it. You can sort of become a part of that workman who or workwoman who made that object hundreds of years ago. It's just a marvelous connection. Okay, let's wrap this one up and move on. Let's see. Okay, so Cellini, who is this fellow? So as I mentioned, he lived from 1500 to 1571. He was a very celebrated goldsmith, even in his day. He was really well known. Everybody wanted him to work for him, that sort of thing. He was also a pretty, like I said, a bit of a scoundrel. And he's well known in particular, because, not only because of his amazing pieces of work, but also because he produced an autobiography and also some other treatises on art and goldsmithing and this, that, and the other, which have managed to survive and come down. And from those, so I'm going to read to you a little bit in a while from his autobiography. It's a really amazing read. By that, I don't mean that everything that he did was great and good. According to today's morals, I would say, to a lot of it. So as I'm reading, if I suddenly pause and seem to be skimming over something, it's because we have a mixed age audience, and this is also going to be on a public forum eventually. And I don't, some of it's just not so appropriate. But what it's really wonderful for is getting a sense of the tumultuous times during which these amazing works were being created by Michelangelo and everybody else. It's just really extraordinary. Now this, the drawing on the left is one that Cellini did of himself. The one on the right is supposedly a self-portrait that he did also, a painting which I believe is now in Russia. I understand that a great deal of money was spent trying to determine the provenance of that painting. And I guess as far as I'm concerned, the jury is still out. But as far as the owner is concerned, he feels that it does indeed, it was indeed painted by Cellini. So that part we're not quite sure about. But one of the things Cellini did in his goldsmith shop, and he would have different numbers of assistants and different people would help him. He ended up having various different business relationships with all sorts of people, popes, dukes, kings, that kind of thing, and often would find himself being able to talk them into giving him a post with their mint, where he would be able to help create the artwork for the actual coins that were being used. And it's there was a controlled money system, but at the same time, it came from whoever that was. If the Duke wanted a new coin, the Duke got a new coin, and he got somebody like Cellini to make one. So these were done sort of as little portraits. Cellini would sit there and actually draw the fellow in wax, which would then be made into a plaster cast, from which a mold would then be made. And then those particular dies for the coins were actually quite controlled. Now, he did all sorts of other things. He did sculptures such as this Perseus holding the head of Medusa, which is a larger than life sculpture. He did busts of various different people. This one of COSSMO the First, is just extraordinary in the detail. You can see here a little bit of the shoulder. All of this would have had to be drawn out first. You know, he would have been able to do some stuff on the fly because he was the fellow actually doing the wax, you know, the plaster cast, but he would need some sort of direction of what was going to go where and how the form turned. This is a shield that he did for Francesco I, and it's just extraordinary in its detail. So each one of these pieces would have been carved in the wax. How it was constructed, I can't tell you, but it is just an amazing work. So another thing that he is extremely famous for is this Saliera. The Saliera is actually just a name for a salt cellar. You can see over there on the left, or the top, is the bowl where the salt would actually be. Oops. I think somebody needs to mute themselves. So, and then I think the pepper was supposed to be over there, that little building kind of to the left. But how exactly that pepper was supposed to work, I'm not quite sure. But I definitely know the dish itself was for salt. Now, by the time these very elaborate salt cellars were being developed, they were not necessarily always being used for those items, for salt or whatever, but they would have definitely been placed in front of the most important person on the table. You know, that would be like, this is your salt bowl. Nobody else gets to use this. So this piece, not only is it just fantastic, but it also got stolen in 2003 from the museum in Vienna, where it has now been returned to, and was gone for a number of years. And the story of that is an interesting tale in and of itself. There is a book that somebody who was a high-level security officer at the Metropolitan Museum wrote. I think it's a tale that covers 6 different stories of art theft, and I'll have to look up the title for you and tell you in a future class. But it covers this particular the theft of this particular Saliera. So I just wanted to show you a couple of other views. You know, like I said, an artist with Silverpoint had to work on all of this stuff. Okay, so we are now at the point of doing our last drawing that I hope we now have about 25 minutes to do. This is the last figure drawing that you'll be doing this summer with me. So we're going to go for it with this particular Cellini statue. As I mentioned, it's quite large. Now, when you look at this, you might be going, oh my goodness, Elizabeth, what the heck? So first, you don't have to draw the whole thing, right? We never have to draw the whole thing. You can just draw the hand, you can draw Medusa's head, you can draw Perseus's head, you can draw just the little helmety thing that his little wings up there on his head. You don't have to draw everything. But what I would like you to do is just take a moment before you get started and have a look at this thing. Squint at it and look at the black and white areas, just like we normally would. And then work on one section or another, perhaps Perseus's face, that would be a good starting place, or Medusa's face. And just look at it from a matter of proportion and from dark and light. I selected this particular shot on purpose because it doesn't have a lot of color added into it. It's just the shadows that are going on that really sort of create the form. So if you're working in Silverpoint, you want to keep that business around the cheeks to a minimum to start off with. You know, to start off with, what you want to do is check those angles. Grab your pencil or whatever and look at the angles on the screen. You know, how is Perseus's head? What are the main angles of the front of his face, which is relatively flat, underneath his chin, you know, and then his chin running up the side of the neck to that sort of winged thing. You know, what are the angles, the main angles of the arm? You know, what is the basic kind of overall sort of triangular shape of Medusa's head? You know, get those big sort of outside lines and some of those interesting interior lines sorted out before you decide before you get in there with the eye, because I know how you are, because that's the sort of thing, you get sucked in with these details, don't you? And I found exactly the same thing when I was messing around with Silverpoint. One of the things that's nice about drawing from those cast images is that you can only do one thing at a time, the nose, the mouth, or whatever. But then if you've practiced with that, when you approach something like this, it's not so difficult. Now, a couple of things. We've got a lot of lost edges here. As Perseus's eye goes underneath the eyebrow, we can't see what's going on there. And so do not draw what you can't see, even though there's like a little interior corner to your eye. Likewise, under his nose, or the same with Medusa, you can't see what's going on under the nose. Just draw the shape, only the shape that you see. So this applies a little bit to painting also, and I know I've mentioned it before. There's a landscape painter, and I think it was Carlson out here on Cape Cod, who was well known for his drawing classes and his painting, that sort of thing. And he would tell students, and I think it was Carlson, I'm not quite sure, but you just put, the right color, the right size, in the right place all over the painting. And if you do that, boom, your subject, you've got it. So it's sort of, I know people just groan when they hear that, but it is sort of the same thing. If you put all the little dark areas that you see in the right place on your page, you will end up with Perseus or the Medusa or whatever it is that you're trying to draw. Now, obviously, what's going on in the hair is really complicated, and that would not be where I start. But there are, if you decide, hey, I really just want to study what's going on in the hair, and I really am not up for trying another one of these faces, Elizabeth, maybe working on those curls and seeing how that goes. What I think is really fascinating is thinking about how all of this started as various wax models, that were made into casts, and then were made either silver or bronze or whatever ended up, but that they would have all started with drawings, that some artist somewhere sat down like Cellini did and said, hey, I've got this great idea for how I'm going to do this statue, and I think it's going to look like this, and sketched it out just like we are sketching it out. So you can pretend, for example, that perhaps you're an apprentice for a competing metalsmith or goldsmith, and that smith has sent you, the apprentice, over here to quickly sketch what's going on because he wants to knock it off for his Saliera that he's going to build, or something like that. Like I said, this is large. This is over 7 feet tall, but you'll see in museums often there are small reproductions that have been done over the centuries because people have just been so enamored with that. So while you are sketching away, I'm going to read a little bit from the autobiography of Benvenuto Cellini. And I'm going to jump around just a little bit. I'm not quite sure how long it's going to take me to read, so we'll just get started. And I'm just going to start with the very first page to give you an introduction. So, the life of Benvenuto, the son of Giovanni Cellini, written by himself in Florence. I first began writing this life of mine in my own hand, as can be seen from some of the odd pages attached here, but it took up too much of my time and seemed utterly pointless. So when I came across a son of Michelangelo of Pieve Agrippine, a young boy of about 14 who was in poor state of health, I set him to the task. And while I worked, I dictated my life to him, with the result that as I quite enjoyed doing this, I worked much more keenly and produced a great deal more. So I left the burden of writing to him, and I hope to carry on with the story as far as my memory allows. Now, here's an Elizabeth aside. Most people don't think that this kid he refers to actually wrote this out. There are 900 something pages to the original manuscript. And they really think that Cellini wrote them himself. But I was really amused that he was making sure that it looked to everybody like he was busy, thank you, on his commissions while this was going on. Okay, to continue. No matter what sort he is, everyone who has to his credit what are really seem good or great achievements, if he cares for truth and goodness, ought to write the story of his own life in his own hand. But no one should venture on such a splendid undertaking before he is over 40. And now that I am leaving the age of 58 behind me and find myself in my native place, Florence, my thoughts naturally turn to such a task. Like all other men, I have often had to struggle hard with fortune, but now I am less troubled by adversity than at any time before in my life. And in fact, I believe that my mind is more at rest and that I'm enjoying better health than ever. I remember some of the delightful and more of the indescribably terrible things that have happened to me. And when I think back to them, I am startled to realize that I am really 58 years old. And with God's help, I'm prosperously growing older. Okay, I will note that as he wrote this, which was over the course of a decade or so, and he sort of left off at some point in the future, things did, he was not doing quite as well as when he started off. Things had been very difficult in Italy in general. And, the machinations that the top artists had to go through to maintain the good graces of their patrons took some real maneuvering. I mean, if you read this, the political machinations of our day will seem like nothing in comparison. So he starts the book off going over a little bit about, how he was born, how he grew up, and this, that, and the other. And so we're going to sort of rejoin him a little bit later in his early life. When my father began teaching me to play the flute and to sing, although I was at a tender age when children love blowing whistles and playing with toys of that kind, I hated every moment of it and would only sing or play the flute to obey him. At that time, he was busy constructing wonderful organs with wooden pipes and harpsichords, the most beautifully made that one could find at that period, as well as viols and lutes and harps, all of them superb works of craftsmanship. Because of this, he was an engineer and he worked wonders in designing all kinds of apparatus for lowering bridges, for example, for operating mills. He was also the first to do good work in ivory. But he fell in love with music, which became a second wife to him. And perhaps because of that little flute, which he played far too much, the fifers of the Cicerni asked him to join them. For a time, he played with them merely to amuse himself, and then they pestered him into becoming a member of their band. Later on, when Lorenzo de' Medici and his son Piero, who was very fond of him, saw that he was spending all his time on the fife and so neglecting his real talents and his fine profession, they had him removed from it. My father took this very badly, convinced that they wronged him deeply. He immediately resumed his trade and made a mirror of bone and ivory about a cubit in diameter and ornamented with figures and foliage. It was exquisitely designed and executed in the shape of a wheel with a glass in the middle, and round it were 7 circles in which he had carved in ivory and the black bone, the 7 virtues. The looking glass itself and these virtues were balanced in such a way that when the wheel was spun, all the virtues revolved with it, but as they were weighted at the base, stayed upright all the time. As he knew a little Latin, he had inscribed around the mirror a verse in Latin which ran, "For all the turns of fortune's wheel, virtue remains erect." Shortly afterwards, he was restored to his post among the fifers. Some of these things took place before I was born, but as I remember being told about them, I do not want to leave them out. In those days, the musicians were all members of the most respected trades, and some of them belonged to the greater guilds of silk and wool. That was why my father was not ashamed to follow such a profession, and his greatest ambition, as far as I was concerned, was to turn me into an accomplished musician, and I was never more miserable than when he used to talk to me about it, saying that I showed so much promise that if I wanted to that I could outshine anyone in the world. As I said, my father was a devoted and very loyal follower of the House of Medici, and when Piero was banished, he entrusted my father with very many extremely important matters. And then when subsequently the magnificent Piero Soderini was elected, he remained in his post as a musician, and Soderini, knowing his tremendous abilities, began to make use of him in a large number of important undertakings as an engineer. For as long as Soderini was in Florence, he treated my father with every possible mark of favor. It was at that time, when I was still very young, that my father had me carried to the Cicerni and made me play the flute as a soprano accompaniment to the palace musicians. I played away at my music and was held up by one of the palace officials. Afterwards, the gonfalonier, who was Soderini, made me talk to him, and delighted at my chatter, gave me some sweets and said to my father, "Giovanni, besides music, teach him some of the other splendid arts you're so good at." "I don't want him to learn anything," answered my father, "except playing and composing, because if God lets him live, I hope to turn him into the greatest musician in the whole world." Then one of his old counselors had his say. "No, Giovanni," he said, "do what the gonfalonier suggests. Will he never be anything other than a good musician?" Some time went by, and then the Medici came back to Florence. As soon as they had returned, the cardinal, who later became Pope Leo, began to treat my father with special favor. Now, when the Medici had been in exile, the bowls on their coats of arms at the palace had been removed, and a great red cross, the arms and emblem of the commune, had been painted on in their place. So when the Medici reappeared, the red cross was at once scraped off, and the shield repainted with the red balls on a field of gold, and finished off very beautifully. My father, who was something of a natural poet and also had in him a touch of the prophet that certainly came from heaven, wrote these 4 lines under the coat of arms as soon as it was uncovered. These arms long buried here, beneath the gentle cross and holy, now wait in joy and glory for Peter's mantle to appear. This epigram was read by all Florence. A few days later, Pope Julius II died. When Cardinal de' Medici went to Rome, against everyone's expectations, he was elected Pope, becoming the great and generous Pope Leo. My father sent him the 4 prophetic lines he had written. In return, he had a message back from the Pope saying he would find it well worth his while to come to Rome. But my father had no wish to leave Florence. And indeed, instead of a reward, as soon as Jacopo Salviati was elected Gonfaloniere, his position at the palace was taken from him. This was the reason why I began to learn the goldsmith's art. Some of the time I was studying how to be a goldsmith, and some of the time, much against my will, how to play the flute. When my father insisted that I was to become a musician, I begged him to just let me spend a few hours a day at designing, and I promised that just to please him, I would give the rest of my time to practicing music. When he heard this, he said, "So you get no pleasure out of playing?" I replied that I did not, and that I thought it a despicable art compared to the one I was set on. My good father, in despair, sent me along as an apprentice to Cavaliere Bandinello's father, who was called Michelangelo. No, sorry, I'm murdering that name, and was a very competent goldsmith from Binza de Monte. His family was very undistinguished, and he was the son of a charcoal burner. There is no blame attached to Bandinello because of this, and after all, he founded the fortunes of his family, but it is a pity he did it so dishonorably. However that may be, I have no need to say anything else about him here. I had only been there a few days when my father took me away again, as he could not bear living without seeing me. So I had to go on playing the flute very unhappily till I was 15. If I set out to describe all the great events in my life up to then and all the great perils that came my way, I would astonish anyone reading about them. But as I must not write too much, and I have a great deal to say, I shall leave them out. When I reached the age of 15, against my father's will, I placed myself in a goldsmith shop with a man called Antonio di Sandro, who was known as Marcone the goldsmith. He was a first-rate craftsman and a very fine man, high-minded and generous in everything he did. My father would not let me be paid like other apprentices, in order that, as I had adopted this craft from choice, I might be able to spend as much of my time designing as I liked. I was only too glad to do so, and that excellent master I was serving took incredible pleasure in my work. He had only one son who was illegitimate, and he often used to give me his orders in order to spare me. My desire to learn the art, or rather my natural talent for it, in fact, both of them were so impelling that within a few months I found myself rivaling not only the good but the best young craftsmen there were, and I began to profit from my labors. For all of this, I remembered to cheer up my lovable old father now and again by playing the flute or the cornet. He used to weep and sigh his heart out whenever he heard me play. So out of filial affection, I often used to give him the pleasure in this way, even pretending to enjoy it myself. At that time, I had a brother who was 2 years younger than me. He was very high-spirited and daring, and afterwards he became one of the great soldiers in the school of that marvelous Lord Giovannino de' Medici, the father of Duke Cosimo. My young brother was then about 14 and I was 2 years older. One Sunday, just about 2 hours before sunset, he started a fight between the San Gallo and the Pinti Gates with another young fellow of about 20. They were both carrying swords, but my brother attacked with such boldness that he wounded him badly and went to close in. There was a crowd of people standing by, including a good number of the wounded man's relations. When they saw that things were going badly for him, they began using their slings, and one of the stones struck my poor young brother on the head. Immediately, he fell to the ground as if dead. Now, I had happened to come upon the scene completely unarmed and unaccompanied, and had been yelling at him to beat a retreat, since what he had done was enough. In the meantime, he fell down senseless in the way I said. Straight away, I ran up, seized hold of his sword, and stationed myself in front of him, confronting a row of swords and a shower of stones. but I stayed my ground till some tough soldiers came up from the San Gallo gate, and astonished at finding such great courage in someone so young, rescued me from that furious mob. I carried my brother home for dead, and then after we went in, with a great deal of effort, he came to his senses. When he was better, the eight, and I'll just say as an aside, the eight are sort of like the judges for various different crimes and things that are going on. The eight, who had already condemned our adversaries, banished them for a number of years and sentenced us to be exiled for 6 months at a distance of 10 miles from Florence. Let's go together then, I said to my brother. So we left our poor father, and as he had no money to give us, he gave us his blessing. I made my way to Siena to find a charming man I knew called Maestro Francesco Castoro. I had been with him once before when I ran away from my father, and I had stayed with him for several days, working at the goldsmith's trade till my father sent for me. So when I arrived, Francesco recognized me at once and gave me some work. As well as this, he provided me with lodgings for as long as I should be in Siena. My brother and I moved in, and for several months I concentrated on my work. My brother knew a little Latin, but he was still too young to have acquired any taste for study, and he used to spend all his time amusing himself. The next thing that happened was that Cardinal de' Medici, who later became Pope Clement, was appealed to by my father and called us back to Florence. Then one of my father's pupils, in tune with his own nasty character, suggested to the cardinal that I should be sent to Bologna so that I could learn how to play really well from a famous professor there called Antonio. In fact, this man certainly was a great musician. The cardinal informed my father that if he sent me to Bologna, he himself would provide me with useful letters of introduction. My father, who nearly died of joy at such a prospect, had no hesitation. And at the same time, as I wanted to see the world, I was only too willing to go. At Bologna, I found a job with a man named Maestro Ercolo de Pifero and began to earn some money myself. All the same, I used to go along every day for my music lessons, and within a few weeks, I had made very good progress at that cursed art. But I reaped a great deal more from being a goldsmith, because as the cardinal had not given me any help at all, I went to live with a Bolognese miniaturist called Cavalletti. And there I started doing designs and worked very profitably. At the end of 6 months, I made my way back to Florence, much to the annoyance of that former pupil of my father's, Piero. To please my father, I used to go along to his house to play the cornet or the flute with his brother, Girolamo, who was a few years younger than Piero. Quite unlike his brother, Girolamo was an honest, likable young man. One day, my father turned up at Piero's house to hear us play, and he was so pleased with my performance that he said, "I don't care who tries to stop me, I am still going to make a marvelous musician out of him." Piero gave a true enough answer to this. "Your Benvenuto," he said, "will get much more honor and profit if he studies how to be a goldsmith than he will out of this fifing nonsense." My father was so furious, especially when he saw that I agreed with this, that he lost his temper and said, "I know all the time that it was you who was trying to frustrate this great ambition of mine, and it was you who had me dismissed from my post at the palace. You paid me with a kind of ingratitude that is usually shown in return for great benefits. I got you your post, and you lost me mine. I taught you all the music you know, and you prevent my son from carrying out my wishes. But just you bear in mind these few words of prophecy. In a matter of weeks, not years or months, your fortunes will utterly collapse because of this shameful ingratitude of yours." Then Piero answered back, "Maestro Giovanni, most men, when they grow old, grow soft in the head as well, and that's what you have done. I'm not at all surprised, seeing the way you've squandered all you have ever had without considering what your children may need. Now I mean to do exactly the opposite. I shall leave so much to my sons, they'll be able to help yours out." To this, my father replied, "No bad tree ever bore good fruit, quite the opposite, in fact. And let me add that you're a scoundrel and that your children will go soft in the head and that they'll be poor and come begging from my rich, clever sons." Then he went off with him and Piero muttering madly at each other. I had sided with him and I left at the same time, saying that I would get revenge for the way that ruffian had insulted him if he would let me carry on with my designing. "My dear boy," he said, "in my time I was a good draftsman too. But as a delightful rest from the hard work it calls for, and for the sake of your father, who brought you into this world and looked after you and sowed the seeds of all your splendid talents, won't you promise sometimes to take your flute and that lovely cornet and amuse yourself by playing them?" I said yes, and that for his sake I would only be too glad to do so. And then my good old father told me that my skill at music would be the best revenge I could take for the way his enemies had insulted him. Before the month was up, Piero, who was having a cellar built in one of the houses that he owned in the Via della Studio, happened one day to be standing with a crowd of his friends in a ground floor room just above the cellar when he began to talk about the man who had been his master. He repeated the words that my father said about the way his fortunes would collapse, and no sooner were they out of his mouth than the floor he was standing on collapsed. Perhaps the cellar was badly built, or perhaps God, who doesn't wait to the end of the week to pay out what's due, was showing his hand. At any rate, a load of stones and bricks crashed down with him and broke both his legs. The people who were with him were left standing at the edge of the cellar completely unscathed, but dumbfounded with astonishment, especially in view of what he had told them with such contempt just a few moments before. When my father heard what had happened, he put on his sword and went round to the house. Then, in the presence of Piero's father, a trumpeter called Niccolao da Volterra, he said, "Piero, my dear pupil, I'm terribly grieved at your misfortune, but if you remember, it's not so long ago since I warned you what to expect, and the relations between my sons and yours will be exactly as I said." Meanwhile, I was carrying on with my work as a goldsmith and helping my father out of what I earned. Since his other son, my brother Cicino, had, as I said before, some knowledge of Latin, my father wanted me, the elder, to become a great instrumentalist and musician, and Cicino, the younger son, to become a great and erudite lawyer. But he was powerless against our own natural inclinations, which in my case were towards the art of designing. And as far as my brother, a well-built, handsome young man, was concerned, the profession of soldering. Let's see. I went to see the Campo Santo while I was in Pisa, because he has traveled to Pisa during the course of this. And there I discovered many beautiful antiques, that is, marble sarcophagi. In various other parts of Pisa, I came across many other ancient works, and I used to study them assiduously whenever I had time off of work. My master used to get a great deal of pleasure coming into the tiny room he had given me and finding me hard at work. He began to love me like a father. For me, the year I spent with him was a very fruitful one. I made a number of important and beautiful things out of gold and silver, and these made me ambitious to do even better. Meanwhile, my father kept writing me piteous letters in which he begged me to come home, and he never left off reminding me that I should not lose the skill in playing music that he had been at such pains to teach me. When I read his letters, I lost any desire to ever go back to him. Such was my hatred for that damn playing. In fact, my stay at Pisa, when I never touched the flute, seemed like a year in paradise. Okay. So we've got just a couple of minutes here to wrap up your drawing. And yeah, the modesty. My goodness, it only goes on from there. But it's a great read. And, you know, his machinations with his father, the various different intrigues that go on, you know, just sort of the view of life. It's rather, this copy I have of the autobiography is the Penguin Classics version, translated by George Bull. I think that is the most recent translation, and it's well done. It's really well done. And, you know, as I said, there's some bits in it where you're sort of like, you know, but that wasn't the best thing to do, possibly, especially in light of today's mores and viewpoints. But it is an amazing look at what the 1500s must have been like. And hey, drawing plays its part, doesn't it? You know, he's doing his designs. He's hard at work in his rooms, and he is also drawing out the various things that he wanted to build. There are a number of his drawings that have survived. Some of them are ink on paper, some of them are chalk on paper. But anyway, that's basically how it goes. So wrap your drawing up at this particular point, and I'll stop screen sharing in just a second. Okay, everybody, well done. So that got us right through a whole section of antiquity, didn't it? And I got to read you a little, which is wonderful as well. So next week, we'll be moving from this onto abstraction. What does that mean? I'll tell you all about it. We'll have 2 weeks to play with different ideas and concepts. Everything from how you go about sort of drawing something out of your head where you want to use symbols and and abstraction rather than realism to get your point across. And also how to use the ideas of abstraction to simplify what you're looking at to make a better drawing. You know, when we're looking at some of those amazingly detailed things that we just saw from the goldsmiths, we don't necessarily want to go to that kind of detail in everything that we're drawing. So how do we get there? And abstraction is one of the ways to make that happen. So any drawing media you have will be useful. Next week, you can do charcoal or pencil or Silverpoint, anything you want to, or mix them up together. I'm definitely going to be showing you some ways to start to figure out how to mix them together. And if you think about it, if you're just doing a pencil sketch under a charcoal drawing or under your trois couleurs, or you're mixing pencil and Silverpoint, or you're even doing the gouache with the Silverpoint and a little charcoal, you're already doing mixed media. That's all mixed media really is. It's just putting a bunch of things together like that. So I look forward to seeing you next week when we start on doing a little bit with abstraction and mixed media, and we'll go forth from there. Thank you all.
Thank you.